Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer O'Neill. I am the director of the online social work program at the University of New England. We're doing a series of short videos about topics that are interacting with COVID that have to do with our different areas and majors. So I've brought together 3 of my stellar faculty to talk today about grief and the role that grief is playing in the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves, starting with Pat.
Hi, Dr. Pat Kokoma, full-time faculty for the MSW Online program at UNE.
And Brian.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Rybczynski, and I am a full-time faculty here at UNE as well.
Hi, I'm Susan Osofsky, and I'm an adjunct faculty here. And in my other life, I have a full-time private practice in Richmond, Virginia.
Great. So one of the things about our faculty, all of our faculty, for the most part in our program, is that they are all practicing therapists, practitioners. So they bring that experience from their daily life and their daily clients into the classroom. So we thought today that we just have, what will be a casual conversation, but hopefully an informative conversation. So I've set up some questions for you guys to answer. They're all related to grief. So starting with you, Pat, can you talk to us a little bit about what anticipatory grief is and kind of how that plays into what we're experiencing with the pandemic?
Well, sure, thanks. Anticipatory grief is about what the future holds regarding loss. It's a normal occurrence with regards to grief. If we know somebody who is terminally ill, we anticipate their death. And so anticipatory grief usually centers around death. When it comes to the pandemic that we're experiencing, we're anticipating a future of unknown continued losses. Maybe the unknown continued loss of employment or health or resources, or even the everyday routines that we're so accustomed to having. So it's very much like not knowing when something positive is going to happen at the end of our stages of grief and just anticipating more of it.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Susan, kind of building on that, could you talk a little bit about, in a broader sense, the role that grief is playing in COVID-19 during the pandemic? I think people are feeling things that they're not sure what they are. And I think grief is something people really attach to specific events. And then this is such a long-standing going on event now. So people might be a little confused about how that plays a role.
Yes, so I think we're a nation in grief right now. The world as we know it has completely changed. Majority of people are working from home, which means that they're not seeing their colleagues where they often get a lot of support. And so they're grieving the loss of their normal lives. People have lost jobs. There's such a high unemployment rate. So there's grief around the loss of a job, the loss of the people that you used to work with, and fear, of course, around how you're going to do financially. There's also grief around for people not being able to see their friends. There are many people that are at home, by themselves. There's a lot of single people at home by themselves who don't get to see anybody. It's been opening up a little bit, but we don't know how long that will be open, given that the numbers are going up. So we may be closing down again. And without your regular support systems in place, people grieve. People grieve and they don't really understand what's happening.
When this first started, I have a lot of friends that are real true introverts, and they were like, oh, this is like an introvert's dream. And even the introverts are tired of being at home alone right now, which tells you just how much people are really feeling this being at home.
Right. People are also grieving, with Pat talking about anticipatory grief. People are grieving because they don't feel like their lives will ever go back to the way it was. And most likely it won't go back exactly our lives won't go back exactly to the way they were. But with that grief comes a lot of fantasy and scary imaginings.
Sure. Wow. So, Brian, can you talk to us a little bit about what the signs or symptoms of grief? Because I think in such an unusual situation, people might not even be realizing that's what they're feeling.
Sure. Yeah, there's a variety of signs and symptoms of grief, and I think it's easier to conceptualize it if we kind of break it down into there's physical symptoms, there's emotional symptoms, cognitive, and then behavioral as well. The physical symptoms of grief can manifest in things like fatigue, weakness, appetite and sleep disturbance can occur, low energy, low motivation, those kinds of things. Emotionally speaking, there can be very intense feelings of sadness, anger, a longing, especially with COVID, a longing for the desire for life to go back to the way it used to be. People can get really numb and detached, as well as even have mood swings as well. From a cognitive perspective, people can have a hard time concentrating, get really forgetful, and just kind of lose track of things very easily. We can really begin to question the meaning and purpose of life from a cognitive perspective. And we can also get really preoccupied with just losses that are going on. And then behaviorally, withdrawal is common. Not engaging in our daily life tasks is common. And then we can also engage in a lot of like self-medicating or acting out behaviors if we're not careful, like drugs and alcohol, sex, internet, work, gambling, shopping. And those things aren't inherently bad in and of themselves, but if used to with the wrong motive, they can really take on a life of their own and become problematic.
So it sounds like a lot of the symptoms of grief really mirror the signs of depression.
Absolutely.
Right? They're very similar in the feelings of what's happening in your life.
Right.
Okay. All right. So, Pat, I guess we're going to go to you for the definitions tonight. So can you talk to us a little bit about collective grief? Because I think that's something we've been hearing about, even in the press, it's been written about.
Right.
And can you talk about what it is, but also talk about how it's different than just what
Sure. Well, if you think about this pandemic, this is a very unique experience, and as I have mentioned to clients, that if you stop and think about this pandemic has had the same effect on everybody on the globe at the same time, and it's very unique. So people in Australia have felt the same effect as people in New Hampshire or Maine or Italy. So what has come of this? I mean, that's not something that people are really glad to have in common, but it certainly gives people the idea or the facts, actually, that they're not in this alone. Because what they are experiencing is definitely the loss of as life as they know it. We're a society. This society is a society of conveniences. We like drive-through windows, stop up to a Starbucks counter. We like whisking through a store and not have to think about what direction I'm walking in, or anticipating somebody being closer than 6 feet. We have given up a lot. So the losses have been many. Susan mentioned losses of jobs and health, and so we have lost quite a bit. And most of these losses, if not all of them, have been outside of our control. We have had no control over where we go and who we see and how, and work and schools closing. We have had no control over that. So all of this has been a loss. People who are now 5 or 6 people in a small 2-bedroom apartment, for months on end, all experiencing the same amount of loss at the same time is unbearable. So if you think about everything that we've lost during this pandemic, there is a collection of it all.
Do you think, Pat, that has anything to do with the way some people have reacted so strongly to things being
very much so.
So there,
so very much.
it comes
Yeah,
from,
I think when this first all occurred, people were being very compliant with whatever their governor was saying, or their local county, city officials were saying about stay at home and wear a mask and wash your hands. But about two and a half months into it, you started seeing protesting about this. You started seeing people break out of their homes and talk about, their rights to do what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. And so I think people have really kind of been over the top with all these losses accumulating on top of them and not being able to self-determine what they want to do and when they want to do it. I mean, they certainly can, but there's risk involved with that, and it's a double-edged sword for folks. But I think, 2.5 months after being very compliant, people started, looking to get back to some normalcy on their own, putting themselves and others at risk, of course, while they were doing that. But I think that's what you saw.
There's also a sense of trying to be in control of something in your life.
Right. Self-determining.
Following all those rules, you're still without any control.
Sure, right. And no end in sight, it seemed at that point.
Yeah, and that's the part of the anticipatory grief, is that there's no end in sight. Like if you came down with the virus and your doc gave you a prescription of antibiotics for 10 days, you could anticipate at the end of 10 days, you're going to be feeling much better. And sometimes you feel better before that. You should still finish that prescription out. But with this, you don't see any clearing in the trees.
Right. So Brian, we've talked about collective grief, we've talked about anticipatory grief. Can you talk to us about other types of grief? Are there other really specific types or just general?
Yes, there are actually a lot of different types of grief. As Pat indicated, there's anticipatory, there's collective, and I'm going to just really quickly explain 7 other ones that are pretty common. One is complicated grief, which is a form of grief that's really debilitating. It's long lasting. People's functioning gets really impaired, and they have just a really hard time adjusting to the news. Then there is delayed grief, which is grief that occurs after a loss has occurred, after a period of time. And a lot of times that happens because a person is either suppressing their emotions to be able to deal with an impending loss, like somebody who's caregiving a cancer patient, or somebody whose defense mechanisms kick in to help them avoid the reality of the pain. Then there's cumulative grief, which is a series of griefs that happen like one after the other, right in a build-up kind of a fashion. Then there's disenfranchised grief, which is a grief where our society tends to view that particular loss as either invalidating or insignificant, like people who die of AIDS-related issues, like stigmatized. That would be a form of a disenfranchised grief. Or even people who lose a pet, that is viewed as not as significant as the death of a person. So that's another example of disenfranchised. Then there's inhibited grief, which is where we kind of stuff our emotions. And oftentimes when that happens, physical symptoms will manifest a little bit more down the road. Traumatic grief is when a grief reaction gets exacerbated by a traumatic event that happens. And if the person perceives that as traumatic or as terrifying or as violent or as unexpected, that would be considered a traumatic form of grief. And then lastly, there is ambiguous grief, which is a form of grief where a person's lack of closure or clarity to a particular loss. For example, like a missing where there's not, anything specific. And a lot of these types can evolve into a complicated grief reaction.
Wow, I didn't know there were so many different types of grief. Wow. Thank you for that. Yeah. And it makes sense, right? We're very complicated. Humans are complicated. So we have lots of different types of feelings. So Susan, can you talk a little bit about how do we know if what we're experiencing is grief or another emotion? As Brian pointed out earlier, a lot of the kind of the ways that you would feel when you were grieving or, in grief mirror other symptoms of other sorts of health issues.
Okay. Well, one thing that's happening a lot right now is that people are very anxious. And anxiety, what anxiety is the process of fight or flight, where your body is preparing to fight against danger or flee from the danger, except there's no actual danger. So there's no way to release the energy of that. So anxiety is more like adrenaline pumping, heart racing, difficulty catching your breath, tense muscles, things like that. When you look at grief, it's going to be closer to sadness, as you said earlier. So the person's energy will be low. They'll notice that they don't have the desire to do the kind of things that they desired doing before. It's going to feel very much like sadness and depression. There may be tears. Some people who are grieving do get depressed, so you have to watch out for that. But it would be more of that low energy sadness with a lot of thinking about all the things that person is missing. Also, a lot of people are grieving literally the death of people that are close to them because so many people have died from COVID.
Right.
But the other grief is still grief.
Yeah. Okay, well, this last question's for all of you. I would love to hear what your suggestions are for ways of dealing with all these different types of grief that people might be going through during this pandemic, because I think on top of the pandemic, and as you just mentioned, Susan, people grieving actual people, losing people during the pandemic, life is still happening and normal things are still happening and people are passing away from other things, not COVID, and there's loss in lots of other ways. So how do you deal with this with your clients? What do you tell them? What are the coping skills? Maybe we'll start with Pat.
Well, one thing, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I think it's very important for people to understand that what we are experiencing isn't a situational grief. It's pretty long lasting. When somebody passes, whether it's sudden or anticipated, that there's a period of grief that with the support of others around us and the self-care that we do, that feeling tends to subside within 6 months to a year. And the more pleasant memories kind of show up more than the sad memories of loss. With the pandemic, that is just as important, probably even more so. That we're have support around us and we're supportive to others, that we make sure we take care of our physical needs, that we eat well, we rest well, we stay hydrated, we get some natural light, we avoid some of the vices, some of the pleasures that we do, that they don't become more than they had in the past, that we don't start opening up cans of beer at 11:30 in the morning and those kinds of things. So those things are very, very important. I think it's very important that people acknowledge that this is something that's happened to them, that this is a trauma that we're all going through, and that the globe is going through at the same time, and that we pay attention to our bodies, because our bodies will demonstrate trauma and grief, and the stress hormones build up. And if we don't have a place to use them, like if we can't go for a long bike ride, or if we can't go for a long walk or a jog, we'll start having some physical symptoms. Susan mentioned this. So I think those kinds of things, those mindful activities, are very important for us to be doing. And that actually, since we're all kind of like, stay at home or very infrequently can we go far, that actually should probably be a good idea if it becomes part of our routine now.
Okay. Susan?
So what I talk to my clients about is having structure in their day. So I work with them to organize their actual day in their calendars, a time for exercise, a time that they're going to cook healthy food for themselves. If they're doing housework, when do they do it so that they don't feel overwhelmed? Because when you're grieving, you feel overwhelmed by everything. I teach them breathing exercises to help them calm down, because within the grief, there's also anxiety. And also, I teach them ways to be more comfortable being with themselves. So meditation, techniques where they can soothe themselves, where maybe they hug themselves and pet themselves. Or I teach them, moving like this in a figure 8, because for most people, someone did that at some point in their lives when they were babies, and it triggers that that part of the brain that tells you you're being taken care of. I also suggest that they talk with their friends and loved ones, maybe set up Zoom things. I know people kid about Zoom a lot, but it is a way to stay connected with people, because anytime that you're grieving, connection is so important. So those are the things that I work with my clients on.
Okay. Brian, anything else to add?
Yeah, for me, I'm really big with journaling exercises.
Oh, yeah.
I think that it's important that people recognize that grief and loss is not just grief. There's a whole range of other emotions and feelings that go with it. So one exercise that I oftentimes have people do is to just get a spiral notebook. And at the top of each page, I'll have them write an emotion that they are feeling about, COVID. And either when the emotion arises or at the end of the day, they can take inventory of all of the emotions they had. I'll just have them go to that page that they're feeling that emotion and just free flow write to get it out of themselves. And this is a way to help stave off that inhibited type of grief that I spoke of earlier. If they have a hard time articulating their thoughts, then they can just write down the left margin, I feel angry blank, I feel angry blank, and just kind of fill in the blanks. Another really helpful exercise that I like to do is to have them, it's therapeutic letter writing, where they would literally just take out a piece of paper and write a Dear COVID-19 letter, where they would, discuss, Dear COVID-19, this is how you have made me feel. This is what you mean to me. These are the losses that I have incurred because of your existence. These are the things that I miss. These are the things that I'm afraid of. And then kind of start segueing into a more positive frame of, these are some of the lessons that I've learned about myself. These are my takeaways. These are my hopes and dreams for the future on the other side of this. And it's just a really good way to kind of bring it all around.
Oh, great. Wow. Any last things before we sign off?
Just to say, take good care of yourself. Don't neglect yourself during this difficult time. It's really easy to get up and stay in your pajamas all day long. And when you do that, you feel like sleeping. So, take good care of yourself. Get out, even if you just walk in your neighborhood to get some sunlight and vitamin D. Those are really important things to do.
Structure, self-care, socialization, and just, limiting your exposure to negative news and media is really important, as well as just making sure that we try to be more conscious and deliberate about being positive and surrounding ourselves with positive things.
Anything that you can do that you've made the decision to do for yourself, whether it's to go for that 7-mile bike ride or turn off that TV, where you feel a little bit more in charge of you, because this is very overwhelming. It's a big umbrella over everyone. And it hasn't let up. So small steps of things that you can do to better manage your daily routine, which will also better manage your mood.
That's good.
All right, guys. Thank you for your expertise. I really enjoyed this. It was great to hear all the different tips and tricks that you're telling your clients out there. I feel like structure is one of those things you've been hearing about almost since the beginning. So it's great to hear that it's being used as a therapeutic intervention. So great. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And thanks for watching, and we will see you all next time.